What's good, ladies and gentlemen? Welcome to SK Wealth Academy podcast number 110. Is there a hidden gold prediction in the 35-year Chinese yuan US dollar chart? Before I get started, please note that you can download all the MP3 files for my podcast on Spotify, Podbean, Podbean, and iTunes as well. So all you need to do is just search on the internet, SK Wealth Academy 3 C's podcast. The 3 C's standing for consistency, curiosity, and creativity. So there's an old podcast of mine that I discontinued about 18 months ago. So make sure that when you download my or subscribe to my podcast RSS feed, it is the SK Wealth Academy 3 C's as an ABC podcast, because that will be the correct one. And also, before I get started too, because I know in the past people say, what is the, sometimes I don't say the Chinese, I just say the yuan. People are like, what's the yuan? And it's only because people have been listening to American commentators mispronounce the Chinese currency, and a lot of them say the yuan or the yuan, or they're trying to pronounce it like an English word. So that would be like pronouncing the French word denouement like you would pronounce an English word, or the German word Schadenfreude like you are pronouncing an English word. It is incorrect. So they're so used to American financial analysts incorrectly pronouncing the Chinese currency that they don't know the correct pronunciation. So in case you're one that always has heard the Chinese currency pronounced incorrectly, it is yuan, not yuan. Okay, so when you look at the chart, you can go to my new site at malamalama.com/WordPress, and all the links, that all the references I make in this podcast will be in the podcast show notes, so you can just reference the show notes. There will be a chart which I will post, which is the 35-year Forex chart of the Chinese yuan to the US dollar. And at first glance, there seems to be no hidden prediction about gold or the global monetary future. However, interpretation of the chart must be combined with some knowledge about yuan note denominations during this 35-year period and in the periods preceding that chart timeline as well, to really receive the clues to start unraveling the global monetary future. Now, when I visited Beijing and Shanghai a few years back, my first observation when exchanging US dollars into their national currency of yuan was the fact that their largest denominated paper note was only 100 yuan. So in case you don't know what the Forex rate, that was about the equivalent of 15 US dollars. So think about if only a $15 note was the largest denominated US note. And today, because the yuan is strengthened against the US dollar, it's only a few pennies above $14 today. I mean, it has weakened, against the US dollar. So you don't receive as many US dollars. Now you only get a few pennies above $14. So my first thought when I first visited China many years ago was, why was their largest denominated note of such low purchasing power? Because I said, as an American growing up in America, I couldn't imagine if the largest denominated note was only $15, or today only $14. And on top of that, I had that thought because by that time I already visited many surrounding Southeast Asian nations. I don't know, I've probably been to at least 10 or to 12 different Asian nations. And I've been to many Southeast Asian nations of much poorer economic status than China that had much larger denominated notes in terms of purchasing power in US dollars. So I was thinking, what is going on, especially since China had a rapidly growing emerging middle class back then. So it seemed to make no sense to me, especially since there are high-end restaurants and brand name stores that sell all kinds of brand name goods in both these cities, in which many items that were available for purchase range from a few hundred to a few $1,000s. So imagine if you wanted to purchase a luxury good item that costs $5,000 in cash in China. One literally would have to cover a stack of more than 350 bills into the store to pay for that item in cash. So even the act of eating out at a nice restaurant in the city sometimes would require carrying a stack of more than 20 bills just to pay for dinner for two. So, when I thought about that, I really wanted to get to the bottom of why is the largest denominated note in China only the equivalent of $14 to $15. So when I started thinking about it even more, I thought, okay, well, I do know that China, often their government plans on a much longer time frame than Western nations, and especially in America. So I was thinking, well, maybe this had something to do with the fact that it's part of a very long-term plan. So I had to think, well, maybe I have to think in different terms than a Westerner would. But when I asked some of my friends that lived in Shanghai why this situation existed, they didn't seem to know either, because they'd never really given it much thought, because it was just normal to them. If you grew up somewhere, like if you grew up in poverty, even in America, and everyone around you lives the same way, you might not think that there's anything not normal about living under such situations. Although today it's a lot more difficult, because even if you're poor, you're most likely to have a smartphone, and then with social media, now we have a lot more exposure than people did in the past to see how other classes really live. And so again, for my friends that lived in Shanghai, it was just normal for them to pay for any item of a higher price with a credit card. So the easy answer to this question, when I thought about it, seemed to be that by making the highest denominated currency note, sorry, I had a mosquito there, of so little purchasing power, and forcing an entire nation to digitally pay for any reasonably large purchase of just a few $1,000s, that this decision was a decision on behalf of the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party, to track everyone's spending habits. And by doing so, then they could keep tabs on every single citizen, since it was near impossible to pay for any large ticket item in cash. But the more I thought about it, even though last time I was in China, like I said, was many years ago, perhaps 7 or 8 years ago, this answer, even though it, would be the answer if you applied Occam's razor, like the simplest answer is the correct answer, there just seemed to be a little bit more. So I started digging deeper, asking more questions to determine if the PBOC, the People's Bank of China, which is the name of their central bank, if their reluctance to print a larger denominated note than the 100 yuan note might actually reveal something significant about what they're planning for the global monetary future. So if you go to the chart, again, and just find this article, probably be printed at the very end of June or published either at the end of June or very beginning of July. You can find that 35-year yuan US dollar chart. The lowest exchange rate visible on the chart was approximately 1.6 yuan to the US dollar in 1981, which is when the chart just starts. But if we travel just back in time, just one additional year to June of 1980, the exchange rate then was only 1.48 yuan. So not even 1.5 yuan to the US dollar. And at this rate, a 100 yuan note, which was the current largest denominator note and widespread circulation in China, would have been worth closer to 68 American dollars. So say, in America, the largest denominated note and widespread circulation is a $100 note. So having something equivalent to almost $70 makes a lot more sense, right? So just 36 years ago, the 100 yuan note actually would have been a large denominated note versus its consideration today as a paltry-sized denominated note due to inflation, central banker imposed inflation that destroys the purchasing power of our currency, which goes back to podcast number 109, in which I spoke, it is inconceivable and unfathomable to me how people today still by the garbage you learn in business school that central bankers are here to stabilize our money because certainly or do the best thing for us. And I actually had a discussion with a friend of mine about this, and this particular friend said, well, even really smart people don't understand that. And my rebuttal is that person is not smart if they cannot independently think for themselves. Because again, as I also mentioned in podcast number 107, I believe it was, the one in which I did a book review of Carl Sagan's The Demon Haunted World, Candle as a Science as a Candle in the Dark, and Graham Hancock's Fingerprints of the Gods. I said, look, just reading a lot does not make you educated or does not provide wisdom either, because you have to be able to discern about what you read, what is garbage and BS, and what is factual and truth. And a lot of people just believe, oh, I read a lot of books, so I'm really smart, because they're just basically like garbage bins for knowledge. That's what they are. If you just parrot back whatever you read or whatever you consume, even on the news, you're a garbage bin of knowledge because you haven't done anything as far as separating the wheat from the chaff, from the rubbish, and being able to discern, to critically think and discern, okay, what do I need to retain and what do I need to throw away? So again, because even when we looked at the Swiss National Bank, did they protect the Swiss franc? Do the best thing for the Swiss citizen? It was in their constitution that the Swiss franc had to be 40% backed by gold, and the central bankers destroyed it, and then they halved it to 20%, and then by 2014 they drew it all the way down to 8%. And even at 8%, it became stronger than the euro for just a little fraction of time. And imagine if it remained at 40%, you probably would be able to get like 2 euros for 1 Swiss franc today, or maybe even 3 or 4 or 5 euros for 1 Swiss franc. But the central bankers destroyed the Swiss franc, and now it's even much less than even 8% backed by gold, which it was back in 2014. So time and time again, we have multiple examples. We have examples in 194 nations, actually, or how many ever nations. I think there's only off the top of my head, North Korea. Does Cuba? I don't think Cuba still has a central bank. So there's only a few countries. Iran, I don't think, has a central bank. I might be wrong, I think, but those are 3, right, out of the entire world that don't have central banks, because we know after NATO forces invaded Iraq, they established a central bank there with the help of JP Morgan, and we know that where else? In Libya, I believe, even though it's utter chaos there, I believe they tried to establish a central bank, but I have to go back and review because my memory is kind of cluttered about that right now. But in any event, there's only, on one hand, you can count the number of nations that don't have central banks. So basically, in 190 plus nations, central bankers have always done everything that's a detriment to the citizens of that nation. But yet, you have billions of people that still think, oh, we need a central bank because they're good and they do whatever's best for us. So again, when you go back and look at how the yuan was once the equivalent of $68 in 1980, which if you adjust that for real inflation rates would have been the equivalent of several hundred US dollars today. So actually it would not just have been a large denominated note, it would have been an extremely large denominated note. But as is easily observable from that chart over a brief 14-year period from 1980 to 1994, the yuan rapidly devalued against the US dollar from an approximate exchange rate of only 1.5 yuan per $1 to a rate multiple times higher at 8.7 yuan per $1. So the question remains as to why a 100 yuan note remained the largest denominated note issued by the PBOC during this 14-year period, as nations' central bankers typically issue increasingly large notes when their policies cause rapid purchasing power devaluation to cover up the fact that they are destroying our savings and all our hard-earned money's purchasing power. And for example, we've all seen the photos of 10 million Zimbabwe dollar notes circulating widely in 2008, which I will post again on that article. So you can go take a look at it. And I think it actually went to a trillion. I'm pretty sure there was a trillion Zimbabwe dollar note, a trillion. And also we have seen 100,000 Indonesian rupiah notes circulating after the 1997 Asian financial crisis devastated the Asian tiger economies. And since China has a rich history of hyperinflation, including periods in their history when their paper fiat currency became completely worthless, as happened recently in Zimbabwe, and periods even more recently during the late 1940s when they issued 50,000 yuan notes. 50,000. Okay, so why did they not increase the largest denominated note from 100 yuan to a minimum of, say, like 500 yuan in 1994 when they were rapidly devaluing the purchasing power of the yuan? Of course, first answer comes to mind is that China has remained a largely poor nation during that time. And so, therefore, its middle class experienced no significant growth until much more recent times, which is true. And the number of people in China require larger notes that could afford to buy luxury goods. I was going to say cars are goods, and I got tongue-tied. But also, of course, luxury cars and very huge mansion-sized homes was relatively limited up until the past couple of decades. So that, in essence, would answer the question of why the 100 yuan note remained the largest note in wide circulation up until about 1999, however. So that's more than 21 years ago. But since 1999, the growth of the middle class in China has exploded from just 2% or 29 million of the population to more than 39% of its population, or more than 500 million people by 2013. You thought I was going to say by today, right? No, this was by 2013. So now 48%, or roughly half of its population, is considered middle class today, and that's about 691 million people. And a lot of people think actually, the 1.3 or 1.4 billion people is an underestimation of China's true population. So it might even be more than 700 million that are considered middle class. Now, granted, the CCP government's definition of middle class in China is quite wide-ranging, including those that only earn $7,250 a year on the low end, which we would consider poverty to be living in poverty in America, to 62,500 on the high end per year, which is actually quite high today, even when compared to America, because I think the median income in America is only like $30-some thousand. So most of the middle class growth has been in the lower end of this range, not the higher end. So the fact of the matter is that there are literally tens of millions of Chinese with consumption patterns that demand a much larger denominated note than one that is just the equivalent of 14 US dollars. So for about 2 decades, even though most of that growth has occurred on the lower end of that scale, still there's been a lot of middle class growth on the higher end of that scale as well, which I said would translate into tens of millions of people. So for about 2 decades, there's been a larger need when looking at consumption patterns for higher end goods and services in China than the 100 yuan note. But yet, the PBOCs remain steadfast in capping the largest printed note in China at 100 yuan. So what gives? Because even though the yuan strengthened slightly from 1994 to 2020 against the US dollar, it now trades at an exchange rate of not 7.8, but 7.08 yuan to $1 US dollar as of June 2020. It still remains extremely odd, in my humble opinion, that during the entire period depicted in the chart above, given the explosive growth of the Chinese middle class since 1999, so over 2 decades, a 100 yuan note remained the largest denominated note in China, and remains odd until one considers the following factor. And again, so I'm going to return to the fact that the ruling class in China is well known for playing the long game in policy matters, especially monetary policy. So it's not rare for them to have like a 50-year plan or a 100-year plan, even though that sounds ludicrous to those of us that were born and raised in the West, because we think of like a 1-year plan, a quarter plan, quarter to quarter, a 5-year or a 10-year plan is really, really long. Implemented, and those are the types of plans implemented by the ruling class of Western nations. So, unless of course we're talking about the military-industrial complex, and they can go out to their 50-year plan. But when we think of finance, though, we're always thinking of next month or the next quarter. So, under a 50-year plan that would extend out to the year 2030, given that the 50-year plan started in 1980. Could it be the ruling party's plan in China to bring the exchange rate of the yuan to the US dollar actually down further from its current 7-to-1 rate to a range of about 3-to-4 that would equal the exchange rate that existed not too long ago, that existed from about 1985 to 1990? And if such an exchange rate materialized over the next 5 to 10 years, then a 100 yuan note would no longer be considered to be such a small note in terms of purchasing power. So things are kind of coming full circle here. So what event could cause such a massive surge in strength of the Chinese yuan versus US dollar? Well, recall that in the last podcast, 109, I discussed the hoarding of the Swiss franc versus the euro, which is known as Gresham's law. That bad money chases good money out of the system when the franc was still backed by a higher percentage of gold. And if the PBOC, but now I told you it's even much less than 8%. So it fell from 40% back in the day all the way down to 8% by 2014, and now even less than that. But yet, it was still very sought after. So think about this. If the PBOC officially backed the UN with their massive national gold reserves, and we all know that all central banks lie about their gold reserves. A lot of the Western banks, like the US, probably have far less reserves than they actually claim they have, while the East, a lot of Asian countries, and even, I know Russia's not an Asian country, but in the Eastern Hemisphere, they probably have far more gold than they're actually claiming. They're all lying. Some are lying to the downside, or some are lying very significantly to the upside. And so the $1 trillion question is the following: has the central banker's decision during the entire period depicted in that 35-year yuan US dollar chart to leave the 100 yuan note as the largest denominated note in China, has that been a result of a much longer, say 50-year monetary plan that they have not shared with us, that will result in the 100 yuan note once again becoming a note of large purchasing power? And that's the reason why they never decided to create a larger note than the 100 yuan. Because, for example, if they created a 500 yuan note, as I thought would be reasonable around the year 2000, then they would just have to take all those notes out of circulation. So even though that decision to create and publish a much higher note than 100 yuan since 2000 seemed very logical, maybe it's because I did not consider their 50-year plan. So note that if money laundering activities and acceptances of bribes is far easier to track among the population due to the capping of their notes at such a small denomination, that the same corruption that tends to be rampant among whom we all know the parasitic ruling class, it also becomes easier to track their corruption. And this is definitely a built-in facet of a national monetary platform that the ruling class would never desire, because they don't want anyone tracking their corruption. So consequently, it's my belief that the PBOC's decision to leave the largest denominated note at a mere 100 yuan has more to do. I'm not saying that the desire of the CCP's leaders to track the spending habits of every one of their citizens is not a large reason why they left their largest note so small. I believe that's a huge part of it, but I don't believe it's all of the reason. So again, like I said, of course I have to consider the possibility that it is the entire reason, but I'm going to bring everything full circle at the very end of this podcast. So, because right now we see that the Chinese PBOC has already introduced earlier this year. They're rolling out kind of a test phase of a state-sponsored digital currency. Now, you know that I don't think this is the first state-sponsored digital currency, because I believe Bitcoin is the first state-sponsored digital currency, but this will be the second. The Chinese yuan, digital yuan, will be the second state-sponsored digital currency. And they rolled that out in 4 cities earlier in 2020. Shenzhen, Suzhou, Chengdu, and Shenzhen, in preparation for a nationwide rollout that they say will come within the next 1 to 2 years. So, in addition, there are some positive things, even though obviously the negative is the lack of privacy, and no country should ever, no citizenry should ever accept 100% digital currency, because then your freedoms will go poof in the air. So, but their digital yuan runs on a platform called Near Field Communication, NFC, and that does not require even an internet connection to function. So you can make payments offline, and you don't even have to have a bank account. So that will at least make the currency accessible to Chinese citizens that live. We know, like, there's a lot of places in China, as a massive country, that is remote with no access to the internet, no access to banking. So then they will be able to, as long as they have a smartphone, to make payments with digital yuan. But, and people wonder about, oh, is this going to be insecure? Will people be able to easily steal currency out of people's digital wallets? No, because the NFC is basically what that is, near field communication. Exactly what it sounds like, near, right? You have to be near. So all information is sent over an encrypted communication channel. 2 devices must be within 4 centimeters of each other for any communication to occur, any transfer of money. So the probability of fraud occurring through this payment system is believed to be very, very remote. Now, the digital yuan, the plan for the digital yuan is not just for payments on the NFC platform, but also probably, I would assume that they want to use the digital yuan to spread adoption of their currency worldwide. So not just in domestic use, as I explained, but also worldwide. And the positive thing for the Chinese government is that development of this digital yuan is going to obviously obviate the need to use the internationally recognized SWIFT payment system to execute even transfers, corporate transfers that occur within domestic borders, but also internationally. Because one of the biggest concerns, not only for the Chinese government, but also voiced already very loudly and vociferously by finance ministers in Germany, I believe also in France, and even the UK, typically Western nations that Americans will see as their allies, that they have stated great concerns and said that they have to cut back their reliance on the SWIFT system and the US dollar, because they said they were being blackmailed in essence and controlled by US central bankers when they were threatened by having their access to the SWIFT system cut off unless they aligned with them on certain political issues with political agendas. So they wanted to be free of the potential these financial, I mean, they didn't come out and say they were being blackmailed, but they as much insinuated that this is what's going on. We're being controlled politically by these US central bankers because they're threatening to cut us off from the SWIFT system and destroy our economies if we don't go along with their desired political agenda. So from international perspective, most financial analysts will believe that will take years, perhaps even decades, for the yuan to gain widespread international acceptance, even if the launch of the digital yuan is a massive success, simply due to the fact that people they're going to continue to question the stability of the yuan's purchasing power over time, because China's economy is still emerging. But one factor that could quickly transition the world's perspective about the Chinese yuan is if the PBOC goes ham and backs it with gold, and especially if it backs it, say, even with a greater amount of gold than the Swiss franc. You know, Swiss franc in this constitution said had to be backed by 40% gold. What if the Chinese goes ham, like really ham, and backs it 100% by gold? Or even if they just go 50% gold? We saw that people were hoarding francs even when the gold backing was 8%. They were hoarding it over the euro. So the European central bankers feared that that Swiss franc would become stronger than the euro, as it deservedly should, because even with an 8% backing of gold, that is much better than a 0% backing of air, which is what all fiat currencies are today. So if you just consider that if the Chinese, even if they fractionally backed by the yuan by gold, although you can't consider anything to be gold standard unless it's 100% backed by gold, then you could see the Chinese yuan gaining very rapid adoption internationally as well. So just something to think about for now. So always remain intensely curious. Until next time, bless up and stay strong.